I have told this story so many times that my youngest daughter, she was barely 2 the winter it happened, can recite the ending before I get there. She will say, "And then you let us stay, Papa." And I will say, "Yes, that is roughly how it went." And she will laugh the way her mother laughs, with her whole face, and I will feel the same thing I felt that November night on the porch, that a man can be wrong about himself for a very long time. I had been alone at the Cane Ranch for 2 winters. My wife, Caroline, had gone in the second year of a dry spell that dried out more than the land, and I had made my peace with the quiet. That is what I told myself. I kept the cattle fed, and the fence mended, and the house in the kind of order a man keeps when there is no one to notice the disorder. I did not go into Ridgelow more than I had to. I did not encourage company. I was 38 years old, and I had decided, without quite deciding, that the part of my life with warmth in it was finished. November came hard that year. The cold rolled down out of the north, the first week of the month, and sat on the valley like something that meant to stay. I had just come in from the barn. It was past 7 in the evening, dark already, the temperature dropping through the floor, when I heard the knock. I opened the door, expecting nobody, and found a woman and 3 children standing in the dark. She was young, though not as young as she looked at first. I learned later she was 29, with brown eyes that were steady in a way that cost her something, to keep steady. She wore a coat that was not warm enough for the night she was standing in. The children ranged from perhaps 6 years old down to a girl who could not have been more than 2, bundled against her hip. The older boy, who I would come to know as Thomas, stood just behind his mother with his jaw set in an imitation of her calm. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "Our wagon threw a wheel on your road about a half-mile back. I have children and I cannot leave them, and I cannot fix the wheel in this dark. I am not asking for charity." She said that last part carefully. "I can cook, I can clean, I can work. I am looking for a position if you have one. If you don't, I would be grateful for the use of your barn until morning." I stood there a moment. The wind came around the corner of the porch, and the smallest child, the toddler against her hip, pressed her face into her mother's neck. "Come in," I said. I want to be clear that I did not say it because I was a generous man. I said it because the alternative was closing the door on a 2-year-old in a November wind, and even I was not that far gone. Her name was Marin Quill. She was a widow out of Hatchet County, moving west to her sister's homestead in a place called Calver Flat, 3 days' ride on a road that had turned mean. The wagon was her late husband's. He had been a farmer named Quill who had died of a chest sickness the previous spring, and the horse was sound, but the wheel was not, and she had made it as far as my road before the whole enterprise gave way. The 3 children, Thomas, who was 6, and watched everything I did with a quiet, evaluating seriousness. Ada, who was 4 and had already, within 15 minutes of arriving, determined which chair in the kitchen was hers. And the smallest one, the toddler, whose name was Ruth, and who wanted nothing more in the world that night than to slide off her mother's lap and investigate the dog. I had a dog named Luther, an old cattle dog who had not shown interest in another living thing in 2 years. He showed interest in Ruth. He put his gray head in her lap, and she grabbed both his ears, and he sat there and took it, and I watched that happen from across the kitchen and felt something move in my chest that I could not immediately identify. I fed them. Marin had moved to the stove before I could tell her not to, and she had the coffee on and the biscuits warming before I had finished stabling the horse. And when I came in, she had the table set and the children washed, and Thomas was helping Ada into her chair with the gravity of a much older boy. We ate together. Marin barely touched her own plate. She kept cutting things smaller for Ruth, kept watching to make sure Ada had enough. And when I pushed the bread plate toward her, she looked at me the way a person looks when they are deciding whether an act of kindness is safe to accept. She accepted it. "You can have the room at the end of the hall," I said. "All 3 children, if they'll fit. I'll look at the wagon in the morning. I'll pay for the room with work," she said. It was not a negotiation. It was a statement of terms. "Fine," I said. I went to bed expecting them to be gone by noon the next day. They were not gone by noon. They were not gone the next day either, or the day after that. The wagon wheel was cracked through, not just thrown, and the part I needed had to come from Ridgelow, and Ridgelow was a day's ride in good weather. The weather was not good. I sent word with my ranch hand, a man named Pole, and Pole came back the second day and said the hardware man was backed up and it would be the end of the week. I told Marin. She received this with the same steadiness she received everything, and then she went back to whatever she had been doing, which was mending a split in one of my saddle blankets that I had meant to get to since August. That is how it went. She found the things that needed doing and she did them, not in a frantic way, Not in the way of a woman trying to prove she was worth the keeping, or in the way of someone who understood that work was the correct answer to most problems and got on with it. The house, which had been cold in the way houses get cold when they are kept but not lived in, became warm. Not warmer in temperature, though the fires were better tended. Warm in the way that means something else. Thomas followed me to the barn the second morning. I did not invite him, and I did not send him away. He watched me pitch hay for a while, and then he picked up the smaller fork, without asking, and started on the far stall, and he did it correctly, and I told him so. He stood a little straighter. By the fourth day, he was asking me questions. About the cattle, about the fences, about whether the gray horse was faster than the brown one. I answered them. That evening he told me his father had wanted to teach him to ride, but had gotten sick before he could, and that he intended to learn. He said it plainly, without self-pity, and I said I would teach him when the ground dried up, and he nodded like we had made a formal agreement, which I suppose we had. Ada set the table every night, without being asked. She had decided this was her responsibility, and she executed it with great care, sometimes moving a fork an inch to the left, and then an inch back to be certain. She also had opinions about where Luther should sleep, and communicated these opinions at length to Luther, who had no objections. Ruth climbed into my lap on the fifth evening. I was sitting by the fire after supper, reading nothing, thinking about the fence line on the north pasture, and Ruth came across the floor with the decisive walk of a child who has made up her mind, put her hands on my knee, and looked up at me until I helped her up. Then she put her head against my chest and went to sleep. I did not move for a long time. Marin was watching from the other side of the fire. She had a shirt of Thomas's she was letting out at the shoulders, and her hands had gone still. When I looked at her, she looked down at the shirt. She does that with people she trusts, Marin said quietly. She trusted her father. She doesn't do it easily. She doesn't know me, I said. She knows you feed them, Marin said, and that you don't raise your voice. That's enough for a child of 2. I looked down at the top of Ruth's head. Her father, I said. He was a good man? He was a kind man, she said. Not always a strong one, but he was kind and he loved his children, and I am grateful for that. I appreciated the honesty of it. She was not going to make him a saint to a stranger, and she was not going to speak poorly of him either. She had measured him accurately, and she let the measurement stand. Blizzard came on the 8th night. I had seen the clouds building all day, the low flat kind that moves slow and mean it, and I told Marin at supper that we were going to be pinned for 2 days at minimum, possibly 3. She took this in and began organizing things in her quiet, practical way. Extra wood moved inside. Lamps filled, the children's boots left near the fire to stay dry. It hit after midnight. I lay awake listening to it build, and then I got up and went to the front room to check the fire, and she was already there. She was in her coat over her nightgown, adding a log, and she straightened when she heard me and said, I couldn't sleep with the wind. Nor could I said. We sat up by that fire for most of the night. The storm made a sound like something being dragged across the roof, and the walls groaned with it, and inside the fire was steady and the house held. We talked the way people talk at 2 in the morning in a storm, without the usual fences. She told me about the farm in Hatchet County, the good years and the bad, the way her husband's cough had started small and grown until she could hear it from anywhere in the house. I told her about Caroline, about the dry spell, about the way she had held on past any reasonable expectation, and then let go very quickly at the end, and how I had not been ready for the quiet. I don't think a person can be ready for the quiet, Marin said. No, I agreed. But you learn to call it something else, peace, or independence, or having your life in order. She looked at the fire for a moment. And is your life in order, Garrett? I had not told her to use my name. She had started using it somewhere around the 4th day, and I had not objected. Now I turned it over, the question, not the name, and gave her the honest answer. It was, I said, before last Tuesday. She was quiet after that, but it was not an uncomfortable quiet. Outside the blizzard made its noise, and inside the fire burned down slow, and neither of us moved to go back to bed. In the morning, the snow was up to the porch rail and still falling, and the valley was white in every direction. I made breakfast, and Thomas came in asking about the cattle, and Ada came in asking about Luther, and Ruth came in and went directly to Luther, who received her with the dignity of a dog who has accepted his purpose. Marin stood at the window looking out at the white, and I stood beside her. The wheel will come from Ridgelow when the road clears, I said. Yes, she said. There is no guarantee on the weather after that. It could close in again. I said this carefully, as a man says a thing he is not quite ready to say plainly. She turned and looked at me. Those steady brown eyes. Garrett, she said, if you have something to say, you can say it. I don't want you to go, I said. You are the children. I want you to stay. I let that sit for a second, and then I said the rest of it, which needed saying. Not as a cook. Not as a housekeeper. I am asking if you would consider staying, all four of you, as something permanent, as my family. I am aware that is a great deal to ask of a woman who has known me 9 days. She looked at me for a long moment. 9 days is long enough to know certain things, she said. That you are patient, that you are honest, that you do not let a child of two freeze on your porch. The edge of her mouth moved. That you taught my son how to pitch hay and made him feel like a man for it. Those are low standards, I said. No, she said. They are the correct ones. She did not say yes that morning with a word. She said it the way she did most things, practically. She went to the kitchen and began making plans for a longer stay. And she let Thomas find me at the barn that afternoon to say, with the gravity of 6 years old, that he thought they would remain if I had no objection, and that he intended to hold me to the riding lessons. I told him I had no objection at all. The wheel came from Ridgelow 10 days later. I used it to fix the wagon so it could be sold. We did not need it anymore. We were married in Ridgelow in the spring in the same church where I had married Caroline, and I did not feel that was wrong. I think Caroline would have understood. I think she would have looked at Marin, at her steadiness, her dignity, her refusal to beg even when begging would have been easier, and she would have said that was the right woman for a man who needed to be pulled back into the living. Thomas got his riding lessons. Ada claimed the largest bedroom and decorated it according to standards I was not consulted on. Ruth grew up calling me Papa before she knew there was another word for it, and I never corrected her, and neither did her mother. I have told this story so many times. My youngest always wants the ending, and the ending is always the same. I opened a door on a November night because I was not quite cruel enough to close it, and what came through that door was everything I had decided I did not deserve anymore. That is all it takes sometimes. One cold night, and the courage to let them in,